So today we're going to talk about the future of robotics and really focusing on the AI influence that exists in robotics today and how the current workflows could be adapted and improved if we embrace modern viewpoints of AI and how that can change things. So Danielle already introduced me, so I won't spend a lot of time here. But my name's Ashley. I'm the director of design at UEGroup, and I've worked a lot in the medical space. These are just a few of the brands that I've worked with, as well as brands outside of the medical industry. But all of that influences each other and helps really just drive forward thinking, highly usable, unique design approaches. So, as I had mentioned, I have a ton of experience in the medical space. We have, oh, one slide too far. Okay. So, I've worked across patients, medical professionals, and the more business side of the medical industry with sales reps, insurance, those types of structures. So, really touching every user involved. We do a lot of hands-on research and observations, and that's things that I've worked on in patients' homes, in medical offices and hospitals. Operating rooms is where I've spent a lot of time in ambulatory surgery centers as well. Done some cadaver labs myself, as well as worked within labs, pharmacies, and training facilities. I've done a lot of different work within different anatomy focuses, conditions, and using different technologies. But today we're going to focus more on the spine use case because that's where I've observed the most related to operating rooms and robotic surgeries. So even though I have all that medical experience, I think it's really important to clarify that I am in no way a medical professional. I am very excited that I'm able to do hands-on experience and be able to be part of the medical environment and observe those surgeries. But I definitely am not, a doctor. I didn't go to medical school, and so that is an important aspect of, my viewpoint. When I do get a chance to be hands-on, I love to do it. This is a picture from my first hands-on cadaver lab ever. Previous to this, I was only able to watch surgeries happen. Here, I was actually able to participate. And as you can tell from my face, it's a lot different when you're doing it yourself, handling the tools than just sitting there watching. But it was a really great experience. And from that process, I was able to really understand the challenges of the surgery, the things that people need to consider, how people behave through that process, and how to convert that into a really successful design. So that cadaver lab directly related into this product that we did for Stryker at the time. It's an AI surgical product that is doing image analysis to give surgeons feedback in real time if they have completed the surgery to the outcome that they're aiming for, or if they need to continue to remove bone. So this is really the lens that I look at the world. It's through product strategy and product design. And that's where you're going to see this talk continue to go, and my own biases that I bring to the table here. So today the focus is really on robotics and AI, but that's a pretty broad topic in itself. And I want to zoom in on the barriers in the current solutions that exist out there and what a human-centered future might look like. So, it's one thing to just talk about these things in a very loose way, but we want to give you some visuals to really explain how these changes can impact things. So we've done this under a conceptual design that we're calling Humio. And this is meant to illustrate that impact that we can have by doing things in that HCAI way. This was created for this presentation, so there's no NDA conflicts here. So before we dive into the vision and showing those examples, we really need to give you a little bit of context. So we're going to talk about robotics and AI, how they exist today, the barriers of adoption to that, where there's opportunities for HCAI, and then briefly introduce spine surgery so that way you understand kind of the context behind or the environment in which these AI solutions could live. Once we get into the vision, we're really going to focus on the tension points right now between current robotic solutions and the way people naturally behave and want to approach things. And then we're going to show how Humio, our example, can really address those behavior differences, those tension points, and the potential impact that that approach change would have. So let's dive right in. Currently, robotics as a market in surgery is really booming. There is a bit of a race to gain market share and continue to expand a footprint once you have it. So major approaches to doing that is through expanding to new procedures, taking a robot that exists that you already have and being able to translate those same kind of features to a new procedure. Expanding to more parts of a surgery so it can be considered more valuable or accomplish more. So that's a different way of thinking about it. Just continuing to take on more within the same process. And then finally, adding more features and automation and integration with other devices that exist within the operating room to be able to, again, bring more value to the space. So there is this major march towards expansion and having like an integrated smart OR. A lot of that expansion is happening through the integration of AI, and it has been AI has been part of robotics for a very long time. So robotics requires spatial recognition, and that's all done through AI with the digital reconstruction of 3D space to 2D space, mapping pre-op images to what's actually happening in the, with the 3D space of the OR and patient position. Then we have image analysis and processing. So this is more simple in just identifying anatomy and landmarks to more complex things as they've continued to grow over time. So slab segmentation is key to robotic ability. Surface segmentation is a more complex version of that, really being able to understand the anatomy in more detail than just labeling chunks of it. And then merging images, which is bringing together two different types of image modalities and being able to view them on top of each other in the correct position. And then, of course, pattern recognition. This is getting better and better as time goes on with diagnosis support, automated planning, and speech to text. So those are more being developed further in the consumer space and being applied more and more into the AI and robotics space. So looking at all that growth, what does that mean for surgical robotics? The adoption rates are still pretty low. The original procedures that they were applied to are gaining momentum and have a relatively high adoption rate, but most procedures are still in that low adoption rate. And there's a couple reasons why that we're going to go into. So the key barriers for adoption, and these came from white papers that have been published based off of interviews and surveys with surgeons all over. And then on top of that, my own observation. in my own experience working in this industry for the past 10 years. So the different phases for taking on a robotic device in your OR, there's considering adoption, initial purchase, and then long-term adoption. So in these phases, things change differently, what those barriers are like. So when you're originally considering adoption, it's important that people or the surgeons and the hospital staff and the purchasing manager at the hospital feels like it is going to be a useful addition to their equipment. It needs to feel easy to use, not that complex, where it feels like something that they can integrate. And they're all basing that cost of integration with how much it's going to take for the training for the surgical team, not just the surgeon themselves, but everybody in the room that supports them. And then what kind of impact it's going to have on their surgical spaces. So this is really critical because all of these changes that are required needs to be offset. The value of those change, or the value of the platform needs to be offset by the amount of change it's required for them to feel like it's valued enough to make that purchase. And right now, there's question, especially in the spine space, of how useful is it really, and is that really worth the complexity that it introduces into the environment? Even though there's papers published about it being useful, that's something that is questioned by surgeons because they feel like they can do it just as well, that they have strong outcomes anyway. So if you are to go ahead and do that initial purchase, which is something that hospitals are doing for the sake of marketing, patients are asking for robotic surgery. So hospitals are making that purchase, and then once it's there, the staff needs to learn how to use it. And so from that, even though they have it, they've spent the money, it doesn't mean it's going to get used. Because again, it needs to feel easy enough to adopt that people are willing to try it out. It needs to have a easy enough initial experience and a learning process that people don't give up halfway through. One of the ways that this has been proven to be more successful is if the surgical team stays together. So usually in an operating room, there's a lot of coming in and out with scheduling of the different support staff that's in the room. It's not the single surgical team that's always together. And that is a big challenge with the current learning curve with these devices. It really requires, or there's much more success when it's a consistent surgical team always working together. And then on top of that, there's the perceived behavioral control that the surgeon has. They need to feel comfortable working with the robot and that they still are running the procedure. Long-term wise, if you can't get past that learning curve, if you can't get past that adjustment period of that behavioral control, people just won't use it. So overall, we need that success in training and scheduling adaptation and surgical space adaptation. And there needs to be trust developed over time. So that's a lot of barriers, and the current systems, as you can tell by their adoption rates, are struggling to get past them. We believe that the human-centered AI approach is a promising solution because of the mindset it brings to the table. So before we dive into how that mindset is a positive, let's talk about what it is. So HCAI, or human-centered artificial intelligence, is an extension of the user, not a replacement. So it's really all about teamwork when you talk about HCAI. It's about not just automation, but thinking about how a person and a robot or AI algorithm are going to work together to achieve a job. And instead of it being the person is there to facilitate robotic behaviors, it is that the robot is there to support the way that people behave and think. And through that, it's able to foster trust through transparency, and the person that's interacting with the robot feeling like they have autonomy through that. And that's all done through the AI and robotic system having contextual awareness and allowing personalization. So why do we think that this is the future? Because it can deal with the barriers specifically. So managing the intimidating learning curve, we're able to minimize change using this approach, where it's only change introduced is associated to technical requirements or value adds. So otherwise, having it be as minimal change as possible to make it easy to learn and adopt and understand how it fits into your life. The lack of trust that people have in robotics currently, when we use explainable AI methods and showing AI through recommendation instead of prescription, that really starts to build that trust, which ties directly into that aspect of control when it's the robot is there as a reactive piece of the procedure, and it's context aware. That allows it to be a support structure and not a prescriptive thing that surgeons are having to support. So let's talk a little bit about spinal fusions before we dive into what it means for robotic spinal fusions and AI differences. So a spinal fusion is done to cause back pain or to treat back pain. Back pain is caused because there's interference with the spinal cord or exiting nerve roots, which is causing pain. That's usually caused by a collapsed disc or a disc herniation. And they treat that by removing the disc, restoring the height of the disc with a cage. That's what this is called. And then they need to create stability and fixation here now that the disc is gone. So what happens is they use these pedicle screws to hold the two vertebrae in place while the two vertebrae fuse together. So bone will grow in this gap where the cage has been inserted. So this restores the height of the spinal column and creates room again for those nerve roots to operate without causing pain. So everything that I'm about to go into related to the robotic process and how HCAI can change things, this is all insight from my observations. So I've been in surgeries for open spine surgery, minimally invasive without navigation, minimally invasive with navigation, and robotic. So I've seen all the different types of surgeries and comparing across those experiences, how things are different and how people behave and the challenges that they encounter. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to talk about it in the example of the Mazer X robot platform. I'm doing this for a couple reasons. It's because it's a good example of the robotic workflow for spine procedures because it is one of the most popular systems in that space. The images shown are going to be using this robot, and the great thing about Medtronic, they published a bunch of images and videos so you can watch this all for yourself. And I grabbed the images directly from that. So it's all from the same source and readily public information. And then finally, I want to say that the comments that I'm making are not a criticism of this direct robot. It's about observations I've noticed over these different procedures that I've watched, and how I think that we could reduce those adoption barriers. So there's always these trade-offs that people are making decisions with when creating products, and efficiency and optimization can drive decisions that require change, but then make it harder to for people to imagine that adoption. So this is looking at it from a different lens. If you were to prioritize adoption rates, how could we get there, and how would that look a little different? So the key tensions that I've noticed of the way that robotics require you to interact with the system and complete the surgery versus when people do not have, when surgeons don't have that requirement and they're able to do it their own way. These are all the moments throughout that I notice there's forced change. And forced change, it's making a user uncomfortable. So it's not creating a desired outcome. I'm going to go through each of these in more detail. So I'm not going to spoil it here. We'll talk more about each of them in a second. All right, so the first step here, so robotic assisted surgery requires you to place all of your screws ahead of time in your digital plan. So this is telling the robot exactly what it's going to place in what position. Once you hit go, it'll be able to move to all of these different locations on the human body, and be as fast as possible being able to do that because it already knows where to go and there's no fussing with it. This is not a step that is currently done for regular spine surgery. They are doing this on the fly. They are feeling around on the patient, using their tool, getting feedback from the fluoro images taken, and then making a decision on the trajectory and the screw size in that moment. So when we're at this point in the procedure, the sales rep is actually doing these planning steps because the surgeons don't want to bother with it. They don't do it currently in their other methods, in minimally invasive methods. So they're not going to do it now. And so now a big aspect of doing the procedure isn't actually handled by the surgeon. It's handled by somebody who didn't have to go through that educational process. And it's causing them, the manufacturing companies and these sales representatives, to focus on operating the system instead of selling the system. So that's not an ideal setup. Then it comes to registration. So this is a process of mapping the physical world to the digital space. And it's a complicated one. It's hard to learn. So the process has been automated as much as possible, and continues to get better and better. But when there is an issue and the registration isn't meeting the surgeon's standards or is just failing straight out, there's a heavy reliance on the sales rep to help them get through it. But the system isn't really helping you as a user figure out how to fix things. It's just failing, and then you try again, try again. So when we're actually watching this happen in surgery, there's a bunch of interesting tricks that people are trying that's really off label. People shouldn't be doing it. And it's things of trying to block anatomy in the images being taken, so that way that might prevent any kind of noise or distraction from the AI algorithm trying to pick up the different vertebrae and match them together. So there's a bunch of things that people are doing, and this process can take a lot of time and add a lot of frustration. That being said, it is a bit of a necessity. So just like the way that we can make this smoother and people can learn from it, the better. Going into this next piece of returning to familiar methods. So at this point in the procedure, they're marking the incision point of where they need to access the pedicle. Now, if you've done this correctly through the robotic process, your screw position is already set. So really, you should be able to just go right through the tube, say, I'm going to cut here, and move forward with your process. But the fact is that surgeons are not comfortable doing this. So you can see from these images here that they're not just going through and cutting through the tube. They're actually just doing a little mark through the tube, and then deciding with a marker, and then deciding from feel how they want to move forward, and to what how large of an incision they want to make. So this is something that's definitely a control thing. It's a trust thing that they want to make sure that when they're making that incision, it's done their way and it's a familiar way, something that they feel comfortable with. Going into, again, that returning to familiar methods issue, when it actually comes time to placing screws, some surgeons will decide to not use the robot for that process at all. What they'll do is they'll use the robot to find the trajectories and place a K wire, which is really just a guide wire that your tools can go over. So they'll place the K wire and then they will get the robot out of the way. And then by hand, they're going to use hand tools to set the screws, tap the hole and then set the screws, and get that tactile feedback. So that way, if they want to make a change during that time of the screw size or change the screw positioning or those types of things, they can do that without the robot getting in the way. And then again, the system shows you when it's time to place the rod into the screws. The system shows you how long of a rod you need to cut. But again, people aren't using it because a familiar method is using a tool that you can see here where they insert it into the or into the tulips, which are extending off of the screw heads, and measure using that and then cutting and placing it. So even though the system tells them they're not using it, they'd rather use a familiar method. So what is this really saying? It's showing that the procedures that are out there with robotic surgeries are optimized for the robot. It's thinking about what the robot needs and how the robot can execute things as quickly as possible. It's not thinking about the people, the way that they're going to have to change to adapt to this technology, and how it's going to affect their process and the way that they think through things, oftentimes resulting in people fighting with the technology because they're going to try and do it their way anyways. So we've created this conceptual design called Humio, and it's supposed to enhance the surgeon's natural interactions instead of forcing them to do things other ways, which should help their perception of complexity and control that they have over the system. So the primary changes is to support the current workflow that they have so they don't have to learn much in the way of new things, to explain recommendations, to build trust within them so that they don't feel like they have to do work manually, and then to be reactive to real-time direction so surgeons feel in control. They're not having to cater to what the robot expects is going to happen. So what does this look like? The initial barrier of planning being relied on the sales rep. What we're recommending is that the plans are set automatically through surface segmentation. And with that, there's some explainable AI going on here where we're annotating the measurements of the pedicle width and the depth that the screw will go based off of the size. So this way, a surgeon can look at this and say, without having to touch anything, they can say, yep, this is the screw position and size. This looks good to me. Or, I think we could go bigger. Or I think we need to step down a size. And by doing this, not before the surgery, but they're looking at it after the patient has been registered, then they can use their familiar techniques of taking fluoro shots, feeling the anatomy to be able to say, is this something I like or not? So the tools are navigated so they can be mapped to the system. And with that, when they're feeling around, when they're taking fluoro shots, they can say, get this extra level of feedback from the system of, okay, you want to change this trajectory to there, but you're going to end up hitting or going through the cortical bone and potentially compromising the spinal column. So it's giving you more information, but allowing them to do things the way they want to do it. And they're able to update the trajectory with voice control. From there, this is just showing the updated trajectory. And then being able to say we're going to align to that plan. So we're bringing the robotic arm in at this point. And this is a step where they are tapping the bone. So they're using an awl to poke through the cortical bone. And then they're going to use a tap to be able to create a smaller pilot hole, basically. And then they're going to actually place the screw. But at this point, when they're just creating that pilot hole, they're able to feel the bone quality. And this is important because if you don't have good bone quality, you may need to use a bigger screw. Because if the threads of the screw aren't able to sink into the bone correctly, then they can strip out, causing you to have to redo the procedure. So it's really important to get good fixation here with the screws, and they can tell that by physical feedback. So here we're allowing them to feel this, and then if they feel like, I actually want to scale up the screw size, they don't need to mess with the robot to be able to do that. Instead, which you'll see on the next slide once it loads, they can bring in the new screw, and the system, using machine vision, can see that screw that you are planning on inserting is different than the screw that was initially in the plan. And then it asks if you'd like to replace it. So if you say yes, then it updates that plan and you're ready to place that screw. So now you can see the screw coming in and gonna fill that planned area, and then you're ready to move on to the next screw. So that process, we believe, it would massively improve adoption for a couple different reasons. It matches the current workflow, so they don't need to do things differently. They still have the comfort of the feedback that they would get if they were doing it non-robotically, and the control that they would be getting if they were doing it non-robotically. So it makes it more easy to imagine introducing the robot into their workflow, and it makes it easier for them to learn because they don't have to change as much. The big thing that they'd have to change is registration. They'd have to do that. But that's one thing to learn, and that's easier to wrap your head around one thing versus, a whole new process. And because of that, that means more staff would be able to support this easier, instead of having to have more dedicated crews. Explaining recommendations show initially before they've purchased the robot, it shows the value that the automation is bringing and what the AI is doing behind the scenes. Once they've purchased it, then it allows them to drive, it helps them drive decisions. So it helps them make decisions instead of just saying, I'm blindly going to go with it or not. And because they're making the decisions and choosing to agree or disagree, the longer they use it, the more they agree, then they're going to build trust in those automations and feel less need of double checking constantly. And then having it be based off of real-time direction, that makes people more comfortable using it, and trusting those automations in longer term. So the benefits of this, it allows people to adopt new technology without disrupting their current methods and products out there. It minimizes training and support costs. And then these types of changes that we're talking about, they don't require a lot of overhead. It's mostly software changes, and it's about changing the order of steps. So you can do these improvements at relatively minimal cost. So really what this talk is all about is trying to inspire a different way of thinking. So instead of, when you're planning your next robotic surgery or use of AI, if you're not in robotic surgery, instead of thinking about what can we automate with robotics, how can we spread that footprint larger, instead think about how we can adapt robotics to enhance surgeons' natural behaviors. And by doing it this way, it's going to improve perception of complexity and it's going to minimize that learning curve, ultimately getting people to adopt and recommend your product over others. And that's that.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ashley. I know it would be great to just spend a little bit of time doing a quick Q&A before we wrap for the day, but just starting off here with regulatory, do you foresee challenges with incorporating AI, specifically a HCAI approach within surgical robotics as they continue to evolve?
Yeah, so AI in the regulatory process definitely adds complexity. When it's a static algorithm, meaning it's written and it produces the same outcome every time, those are easier to get through the regulatory process. Um, However, it's now much more of a trend to do learning based algorithms. So the more that you interact with them, the more images you feed them, the more you correct those images during use, it'll change its outcomes with the promise of improving them. But from a regulatory perspective, that increases a lot of risk because something that was approved safe and effective at conception may not be safe and effective anymore years down the line. So the regulatory approval process never really ends with those learning algorithms. You need to continually feed them new data, or you need to feed the regulatory platform new data to give them that confidence that it is actually being consistent. And that needs to not just come from one robot, that needs to come from all of them, right? Because they're learning different things at different facilities. So that becomes a much larger process that's more difficult. So this HCAI approach, it can apply to both learning and static algorithms, but really what it can do is it can improve the perception and usability of static algorithms so they can potentially have a larger footprint and you don't need to have that learning complexity. So, it obviously depends on the use case, but it just opens up more avenues and makes the technology more usable.
There's definitely a lot of benefits to an HCAI approach. Are there any, when you think about challenges of organizations who might be considering something like an HCAI approach, are there barriers that they might be experiencing currently that come to mind?
Absolutely. So organizational structure is definitely a factor in being able to use something like this because it is a mindset shift. It isn't as simple as I've been given a feature as a designer and now I'm going to design this feature with this context. It does require the technology to support it, and it requires the execution of it in all facets to work that way and to have workflow and feature implications. All of that, it ties up to a vision, and if the vision isn't supporting HCAI, then it won't work. So you need to really have this at the leadership level of whoever is the product owner or potentially beyond that. So as an individual designer, you can do things that are going to work towards the spirit of this, but ultimately you need to be pushing this message upward to be able to get this buy-in from the overall company. And that's actually it brings a lot of effective arguments to the table because it's about adoption rates and how you can make things, people buy things sooner. and use them longer and promote, which is all things that, people that are higher up want to hear. So it's not just about the users are going to like this more. And that's a really important message.
Definitely important to communicate to the higher ups. As the technology, just one last question here. As technology continues to progress, specifically AI, why would you say that HCAI or human-centered AI is so important, especially within medical devices?
Yeah, so right now I think the world is a bit obsessed over how AI functions and how it can mirror the way that people think, but not from a use case standpoint, but just like how the brain functions, right? And now computers are able to do reasoning similarly. So everyone's so focused on that, and scared of how it's applied, with this notion of replacement, where it is automating and replacing people. But the much more realistic scenario, especially in the medical use case, is a partnership between AI and people, where you're working together to do the same job. So AI can alleviate aspects of the job that are tedious or unable to do with the standard human ability. So with that, if you want to make a strong partnership that's successful, it's not just about the technology working. It's about them being able to effectively collaborate, which is what HCAI is all about.
Amazing. I think that's a great notion to end on here. We're a little bit over time, but thank you so much for the presentation and all of your expertise and your thoughts, sharing it today. I know that it would be great to stay connected either with Ashley if you want to connect with her on LinkedIn or shoot her a message directly through email. Her contact information is right there. And drop us an email at UEGroup or Human Focused AI if you want to talk more about surgical robotics or want to learn more about how we're supporting the medical device industry. And that's it for today. Thank you so much.